Hey nerds, and welcome back. It's a world building special this week, and we're delving into the world of thanatology, or as you may otherwise know it, the science of death. There are plenty of aspects to world building that you'll hear advice about, telling you, well, you need to build a currency, you need to figure out the geography, you need to sort out the economy of the world. Death rarely makes it to the list, and I think that's a missed opportunity for a lot of authors. Death is a fundamental part of life, arguably more so than theology and economics because it was there before any of them came to being. It defines cultures, whether that be through attitudes, customs, and beliefs, or even practices concerning what we do with our dead. They're also intertwined with our day-to-day that we mostly don't even think about death that much, despite it being all around us. From grief to graveyards, death is everywhere, and spending a little bit of time thinking about death in your world can be an easy way of helping you create a culture that has something different about it. So unless you've created a fantasy world where death is no longer present, in which case you have a whole load of other implications we'll have to get onto in another video, then how can you go about world building around the concept of death? Well, unsurprisingly, there are lots of different ways to go about it. So spend as much or as little time as you want on any of the following. You don't need to do them all, and I don't want you bogging yourself down in your world building. We're going to split this all up into 3 categories: pre-death, death, and post-death. And we'll start with the latter because that has implications for the other 2, and we will also split it into 2, namely post-death for the individual, the person who died, and post-death for everyone they left behind. Starting with post-death for the individual, what does this mean for them? And I'm not being glib, you are a fantasy author. While most genres are bound by reality about what might become of us after death, you are creating actual worlds yourself, meaning that what happens to people after death in your world is within your power to decide. Is there an afterlife? What form does this afterlife take if there is? What part of the self exists in the afterlife? Who else is there? Do all people experience the same afterlife? These are just some of the questions you can answer for your world. Take inspiration from other cultures in our world, or just let your imagination run wild. If you don't want the hassle or are feeling a little bit more existential, then say there is no afterlife and leave it there. Your characters fall into darkness, and in the darkness they stay. So how much of all of that you incorporate into your story, and how much of it is just background world building to help, all depends on the other aspects of post-death. What happens to those we leave behind? To answer this, you must first ask yourself how much interaction there is between the living and the dead. Do you have ghosts in your world, or any means of communication between the living and the dead? This matters because it's like a little nuclear bomb in your story, because we are naturally curious about the afterlife and would clearly want to ask the dead to find out what happens, so then you're going to have to start answering all those kind of questions. Next, rituals and customs. Let's go chronologically here and start with, what do people in your culture do when somebody has died? How do they act? Do they grieve? Do they celebrate the life that's gone? Console each other? On a more practical level, what do they do with the body? Do they arrange funerals? If so, who is responsible for that, and what support do they get? Are there professions that exist solely to support during that time of life, and therefore jobs that you can give characters in your story? In each culture I create, I start off by thinking about this, about what happens to the bodies when someone dies. I'm weird, I know, but there is no denying that the results are fascinating. In Valrora, where Lasmori and Scars of Cerebra are set, they bury their dead. It's not my favourite, but it's practical. In Saqqara, they use fungi to disintegrate the flesh. In the novella Raveler's Guild, they burn their dead, which facilitates the release of the soul, which is important to the story for various reasons I'm not going to go into. While in a mountainous culture nearby, they chop up their dead and scatter the pieces for the birds. Distinction through death is a simple trick, but very effective. After funerals, we get into longer-term customs when it comes to the dead. Are there festivals like the Day of the Dead in Mexico? Do people honour their dead or forget about them? Do they fear them? And this leads on to a bigger question about grief in your society. Grief is a subject that's very interesting to explore, and I was on a panel about it at Quarancon a few weeks ago. Link in the description below if you're interested. But basically, cultures act in very different ways when it comes to grief, both in how the grieving are treated and what is socially acceptable with regards to grief. Who is allowed to grieve? For how long? There are even differences in terms of what is socially acceptable to grieve about in public, which you can see by looking at how attitudes towards miscarriage have changed in our world over recent years in some Western societies. Alright, now we move on to death itself. Why do people in your world die? The answer will inform questions like where people die, in hospices, hospitals, religious grounds, at home, or by wandering off into the woods, all of which will help create flavour for your world. Break death down into each of the big four: natural deaths, accidental deaths, homicidal deaths, and suicidal deaths. Different societies have very different rates of all of them, and how a person dies has a huge impact on the community, especially at the macro level, both in terms of the healing and the resources invested. If you have a community where lots of people are being murdered, then this affects law enforcement, the economy, migration, and so much more. If lots of people are dying from disease, then is more money going from taxes into tackling the disease and trying to find a cure? There's a lot of cause and consequence in this world building. Another factor that will feed into this: geography. What kind of natural dangers are there to be found in your location that could increase the natural incidence of death? Death is kind of like the world building tool that links together all of these other things that you will have had to think about to create your world. So once you've got the how down, this will give you a better understanding of the when. For all four of the ways people die, then you will find variation in the age that people die at. Ask yourself what the life expectancy is in your world. Ask what your infant mortality rate is. Do you have differences according to race, sexual orientation, or gender? All of your answers will have huge impacts on the type of world you're creating. And if you can't answer these questions, it may be a sign that you're lacking a key understanding in certain parts of your world that you might need to feel more satisfied with the world that you're creating. So once you have your death statistics for your world, let's move on to the pre-death years. How people act in this time will be heavily dictated by your death stats. Ask yourself if people prepare for their own deaths, such as by writing wills or arranging their own funeral preparations, or just telling their loved ones what kind of arrangements they want when they die. Figure out what people believe will happen to them when they are gone. Remember that depending on your world, this doesn't have to be the same as what will actually happen to them. We don't know. Unless you have a direct means of communication with the dead, it probably won't be any different in your world. Do people accept death as an inevitable part of life? Or are they actively trying to prevent death? This could be through magic, through trying to live more healthily, through prayer, or through any number of ways that are dependent on the culture you're world building. You could genuinely have people believing that eating slugs makes them live longer because that was a fable they were told when they were a child. So that draws us to the end of the post-death, death, and pre-death summation of the video. But there are bigger picture questions here that you can use death in your world building to ask. They will probably end up having a big impact on the theme of your story and can help your stories be more philosophical in nature. You could ask questions of legacy, such as the role of a biological legacy, i.e. having children, a cultural legacy through your contribution to progressive thinking or through art or science or philosophical debate, your geopolitical legacy through conquering land, or whatever else the culture you're creating values as a form of legacy. There's a lot of interesting questions to be raised here. To do this, you just need to figure out what matters in your society. Other themes death can be used to explore: obviously mortality in the afterlife, but also the role of aging in society, the role of grief, and so many more. Some of these themes are more well-trodden than others, but there are still a lot of ways that fantasy can be used to give these themes a fresh take. So get on with it, have fun with whatever you create, don't get too macabre about it all, and have a great time. Bye, my nerds!